Welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. The Finnish Air Force may be famous for many things during the Second World War, but one thing that often flies under the radar in the aviation sphere is their native industry, which, although small during the war, did produce some notable designs. The aircraft that we'll be looking at today is one of the most interesting, built to be on par with the late war 109. The VL Pyörremyrsky, or Hurricane in Finnish, and I apologize for that pronunciation, was a high-power fighter aircraft sporting a mixed armament of cannon and machine guns, and a design that's often considered reminiscent of a 109, although it was built essentially from scratch. Constructed mainly out of wood and being powered by a German Daimler-Benz DB605, the Finnish Hurricane came too late to see service in the war, and only one prototype was ultimately constructed. But to take a closer look at the aircraft and why it came to be, we must head back several decades. Formed in 1918, the Finnish Air Force would not take quickly to producing domestic aircraft, starting first by using the state aircraft factory's workshops to produce license-built copies of foreign aircraft, such as the Hansa Brandenburg W-33. The factory would see the majority of its work in repairing and overhauling aircraft in the Finnish Air Force. In fact, it wouldn't be until the late 1930s, as the war clouds were brewing in Europe, that the Finns first began to express interest in producing a native aircraft. Ultimately, this would result in the VL Pyörremyrsky, Finnish for storm, of which 51 were produced, starting serial production in autumn 1942. The aircraft, although it demonstrated some serious issues, was a fairly strong headway into the world of fighter production, and in fact was the second fastest Finnish Air Force aircraft of the war after the 109G. Ultimately though, the Myrsky came too late to see a huge amount of use, and saw most of its wartime service as a reconnaissance platform during the continuation war. However, the pressure for the Finns to produce an aircraft of their own that was a step above the Myrsky began to increase as the war drew on. From 1942, the quantitative advantage of the Soviets began to be joined by a qualitative edge too, as new designs such as the Yak-9 and LA-5 began to make their combat debuts over Finnish skies, a significant cut above the fighters the Finnish had been fighting only 2 years before. Although this was somewhat offset by the transfer of 160 109Gs from their German ally, the deteriorating situation of the Luftwaffe meant that the Finns could not reasonably expect more where they had come from, and so alternative solutions had to be explored. On the 27th of November 1942, conscious of the fact that the situation could turn dire if they didn't find a way to get modern, capable fighters to frontline squadrons, an order was drafted for a new aircraft design under the name Pyörremyrsky. The state aircraft factory, tasked with overseeing the design and construction work of the new aircraft, put Torsti Verkkola as chief designer of the project, who immediately set to work. The specification was, to its credit, extremely broad, giving the design team a pretty open court to play ball. The main idea was that, to save on strategic resources, the aircraft should be built from, to the highest degree possible, wood, which the Finns had no shortage of. The other main directive was that it should be broadly comparable in terms of performance to the 109G. Not such an easy task. Verkkola, chief designer, opted for an interesting approach. He began with the basic design of the 109G on the drawing board, and bit by bit made alterations where necessary to bring it up to the new spec. The central fuselage would be constructed from a welded steel frame, covered with removable duraluminum and plywood panels. The wing, in contrast, would have its main spar made entirely out of wood, which the wing was also skinned from. The landing gear, basically unchanged from the 109, would actually have its location significantly altered, which would give the illusion that it was completely redesigned. A far cry from the infamous narrow track of the 109, the Pyörremyrsky would have wide track undercarriage to give much better takeoff and landing performance. The Finnish Air Force ordered 2 prototypes to be built, off the drawing board and into testing, but the aircraft's progress wouldn't be as quick as hoped. By the time 1944 rolled around, the 109 Gustav that the Finns had been trying to emulate was coming up on 2 years old, and even if the performance was matched, it wouldn't necessarily stay competitive against aircraft the Soviets were fielding for long. Nevertheless, the now finished design on the drawing board laid out a physically larger aircraft than the 109, though its empty weight was only 300 kilograms or 660 pounds heavier. On top of sharing the same 1500 horsepower power plant, the aircraft would also share the same basic armament layout, with twin heavy machine guns in the upper engine nacelle and a single 20mm MG151 firing through the cylinder banks of the engine and through the propeller shaft. The machine guns would be slightly different, however, the 109 using the MG131, with the Pyörremyrsky using a license-built version of the 12.7mm FN Browning. When the hostilities between the Soviet Union and Finland had come to an end in September 1944, the Finns only had a partially complete prototype, at which point the Ministry of Defense basically cancelled all plans for serial production or multiple prototypes, and instead only allowed the single aircraft to be built, which it finally was in autumn 1945. Coming too late to see even the end of the war in Europe, the Finnish prototype stood at 9.1 meters in length, 10.38 in span, and weighing in at just over 2,600 kilograms empty. Bearing the fuselage code PM1 for Puumersu, or Wooden Messerschmitt, the aircraft would undergo its maiden flight on the 21st of November 1945, during which it demonstrated excellent maneuverability and climbing performance, though the flight had to be cut short after 25 minutes, due to a piece from the cowling falling off. Fumes subsequently started to enter the cockpit and the test pilot was saved only by his oxygen mask. By January 1946, the Pyörremyrsky had undergone just one more test flight, when it was transferred to Kuurevesi in central Finland. During flight testing, the aircraft demonstrated a very impressive top speed of 620 km an hour, compared to the 652 km per hour of the 109 G6. In maneuverability and general handling characteristics, the Finnish design had the edge, however, although to be fair this was now almost 3 years after the G6 had entered service. Indeed, the aircraft would generally just find itself a victim of time more than anything else, a good design for an era that had already passed when the prototype was finished. Interest was shifting away from propeller-driven fighters and towards jets. The only significant issue with the design was found to be the glue used in the joints of the majority wooden construction, which wasn't strong enough and was considered a weak point. By July 1947, the aircraft underwent its last flight, racking up a flight log of just 27 hours by the time it was grounded. Put into storage for the next 6 years, the aircraft was then finally struck from the Finnish Air Force rolls in April 1953, by which point the old DB605 would have been pretty difficult to service anyway. Thankfully, however, and it's quite rarely that I get to say this on this channel, but the Air Force officials had the foresight that such a unique piece of Finnish history should be preserved after they were convinced by a group of volunteers, and so they ordered it to be refurbished at the State Aircraft Factory in the summer of 1970, and then put on display at the Finnish Air Force Museum. A group of 5 volunteers, whose names are on screen now, would spend the next 2 years doing an extensive restoration of the aircraft. It was complete after an estimated 1,240 hours, when the test pilot of the fighter 25 years before, Esko Halme, came and visited, saying it looked exactly as it had looked in 1945. So thankfully to the volunteers, the Pyörremyrsky is preserved for us to see. Even that isn't where the story of this aircraft finally ends though, as its basic wing design went on to be used on the Valmet Vihuri, a Finnish trainer of which over 50 were produced. The obvious 109 influence in its design have led many to assume that it was simply a Finnish modified 109, which despite its origins is not true. It was ultimately a fundamentally new design, just with strong ties to the 109G that it was intended to match in performance. Although the VL Pyörremyrsky ultimately was not what it had set out to be, and it arrived too late to see service in the Second World War, It still stands as a pretty excellent fighter aircraft, and one that thankfully is preserved for us all to see today, at the Finnish Air Force Museum in Tikkakoski. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.